Poison in the Parish Garden, a Miss Marple mystery. And yet, even the most peaceful gardens can conceal something deadly beneath the soil. When a respected member of the parish collapses during a summer afternoon gathering, whispers spread quickly. At first, there is talk of heat, of age, of unfortunate coincidence. But small details, too small for most to notice, begin to trouble Miss Jane Marple. A cup set down too carefully, a plant that does not belong, a kindness offered with suspicious timing. As the village attempts to preserve its sense of harmony, Miss Marple listens. She watches. She remembers. And, as she so often does, she compares what she sees to patterns she has encountered many times before. Patterns of envy, resentment, and quiet calculation. Because poison, Miss Marple knows, is rarely about haste. It is about patience, about planning, about the belief that subtlety is safety. So step quietly into the parish garden, admire the flowers, greet the neighbors, and pay close attention. For among the roses and trimmed hedges, a crime has taken root, and Miss Marple is already beginning to see how it grew. Chapter 1. Death Among the Roses. The parish garden of St. Mary Mead was at its most impressive in early summer. Rows of roses bloomed in careful succession, their colors arranged with deliberate pride, deep crimson near the stone wall, pale pinks along the path, and soft whites surrounding the central fountain. Benches had been freshly painted, gravel paths swept smooth, and bunting hung modestly between the trees in anticipation of the afternoon gathering. It was by every measure a place designed for harmless pleasure. Miss Marple arrived shortly before 3 o'clock, dressed plainly, her hat pinned securely, her expression mild. She paused at the gate, taking in the scene with quiet appreciation. Children chased one another between flower beds under the watchful eyes of their mothers. Elderly parishioners settled themselves carefully on benches, exchanging familiar complaints about the weather. At the center of it all stood Reverend Lionel Hartley. He moved easily among the villagers, greeting each by name, accepting cups of tea, pausing to admire the flowers as though seeing them for the first time. A tall man with thinning hair and an agreeable smile, he had served the parish faithfully for nearly 2 decades. His presence alone seemed to reassure people. Miss Marple noticed, however, that he looked tired. Not ill exactly, but strained. His smile appeared practiced rather than natural, and when he believed himself unobserved, his hand occasionally pressed against his side as though discomfort lingered there. She made a mental note of it. Tea was served from a long table near the yew hedge. Mrs. Dalrymple, who prided herself on her organizational skills, presided over the arrangement with brisk efficiency. "Miss Marple, how lovely of you to come," she said brightly. "Lemon cake or sponge?" "Just tea, thank you," Miss Marple replied. "No sugar." She accepted the cup and moved toward a bench near the rose beds, where she could observe without appearing to do so. The afternoon progressed pleasantly enough. Conversations drifted from gardening tips to parish matters, from recent letters received to the ever-present speculation about who might move into the vacant cottage near the lane. Miss Marple listened attentively, her knitting resting in her lap. It was Reverend Hartley's sudden pause that caught her attention. He had been mid-sentence, recounting an anecdote about the spring fete, when his voice faltered. His hand reached out, gripping the edge of the table. "Are you quite all right?" Mrs. Dalrymple asked sharply. Yes," he said. "Just a moment." But there was no moment to spare. his face drained of color. The cup he held slipped from his fingers, shattering against the stones. He staggered, took one unsteady step, and collapsed among the rose beds. There was a cry. Several people rushed forward. Others stood frozen, teacups forgotten. Miss Marple did not move immediately. She watched. The Reverend's body lay awkwardly among the flowers, one arm bent beneath him, his breath shallow and irregular. His eyes fluttered, then fixed on nothing. "Fetch the doctor!" someone shouted. Mrs. Dalrymple knelt beside him, fanning his face. "It must be the heat," she said. "He's been overworking himself." Miss Marple set her knitting aside and approached slowly. She knelt, careful not to disturb the crushed flowers, and leaned closer. The scent reached her almost at once. Not the roses, something sharper, bitter, unmistakable. "Has he been ill recently?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No," Mrs. Dalrymple replied. "Just tired." Miss Marple nodded but said nothing more. By the time Dr. Simmons arrived, Reverend Hartley was already gone. The doctor examined him briefly, then stood, removing his hat. "I'm afraid it was very sudden, possibly heart failure." There was a collective murmur of shock and sadness. "Such a good man," someone whispered. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "So he seemed." The crowd dispersed slowly after that. Chairs were folded away, teacups collected. The roses around the spot where the Reverend had fallen were trampled beyond repair. Miss Marple remained behind. She moved toward the table where the tea had been served. Several cups remained untouched, others half empty. One cup, however, stood apart, placed neatly at the edge of the table, its contents undisturbed. She examined it casually. "Is that Reverend Hartley's?" she asked Mrs. Dalrymple, who hovered nearby. "Yes," Mrs. Dalrymple said. "He'd just taken a sip before he collapsed." Miss Marple lifted the cup slightly and inhaled. There it was again, faint but present. Bitter almonds. She set the cup down carefully. As Inspector Graves arrived to begin his inquiries, Miss Marple retreated to the bench where she had first been sitting. She picked up her knitting once more, though she did not resume stitching. Accidents, she knew, were rarely so neat. Heart failure did not usually announce itself with bitterness, nor did it strike so conveniently in a public place amid pleasant distraction. Poison, on the other hand, favored precisely such moments. As the sun dipped lower and the parish garden emptied, Miss Marple remained seated, her gaze fixed on the rosebed where the Reverend had fallen. Beneath the carefully tended soil of St. Mary Mead, something dark had taken root, and Miss Marple intended to discover who had planted it. Chapter 1. Call to Action. Do you think the Reverend's death was natural, or did one small detail convince you otherwise? Share your first suspicions in the comments below. Chapter 2. A cup too carefully served. In St. Mary Mead, death did not arrive quietly, even when it struck without warning. By the following morning, the parish garden was closed, its gates fastened with a small but conspicuous sign requesting privacy. Villagers gathered instead in clusters along the lane, voices lowered, opinions already forming with remarkable certainty. Miss Marple observed them from her usual place by the front window, a cup of tea cooling beside her. "Poor Reverend Hartley," Mrs. Bantry said sympathetically. "Heart trouble, they say. He was never the same after Easter." "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "That is what people say." And Dr. Simmons would know, Mrs. Bantry continued. He examined him himself. Doctors, Miss Marple said, can only examine what remains. Mrs. Bantry frowned slightly, unsure what to make of that. Later that morning, Inspector Graves arrived. He was already familiar with St. Mary Mead and had learned, through experience, not to dismiss Miss Marple's observations too lightly. "Public collapse," he said as they walked together toward the vicarage. "No sign of struggle. Doctor believes it was natural causes." "Does he?" Miss Marple asked. Graves glanced at her. "You disagree?" "I question," Miss Marple corrected. "There's a difference." Inside the vicarage, the atmosphere was subdued but oddly tense. The rooms were neat, sparsely furnished, and faintly scented with furniture polish and dried flowers. Reverend Hartley's study stood exactly as he had left it, papers arranged carefully, sermon notes stacked in orderly piles. "Tell me about the tea," Miss Marple said suddenly. Graves raised an eyebrow. "The tea?" "Yes," she said. "Who prepared it?" Mrs. Dalrymple was summoned. "I did," she said promptly. "As always, parish gatherings are my responsibility." "And the cups?" Miss Marple asked. "They were laid out in advance." "All of them?" Miss Marple pressed. Mrs. Dalrymple hesitated. "Well, most of them. The Reverend's cup was brought out later." "Later?" Graves repeated. "Yes, he arrived late. I poured his tea separately." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Did you add anything to it?" she asked. "Of course not," Mrs. Dalrymple exclaimed. "Just tea, and milk as he preferred." "No sugar?" Miss Marple asked. "No, never sugar." Miss Marple glanced at Graves. And yet the cup was set apart. Graves frowned. "Could be coincidence." "Could be," Miss Marple agreed. "But coincidence has limits." As they spoke, Miss Marple noticed something else. On a small side table near the window stood a tray with a teapot, milk jug, and a small brown bottle, empty now, its label partially peeled. "What was in that?" she asked. Mrs. Dalrymple followed her gaze. "Oh, that was Reverend Hartley's tonic. He took it daily." "What kind of tonic?" Miss Marple asked. "Something herbal," Mrs. Dalrymple said vaguely. "Prescribed by Dr. Simmons." Miss Marple picked up the bottle, sniffed lightly, then set it down again. Bitter. Not strongly so, but present. Later, Miss Marple requested to see the garden once more. Inspector Graves obliged. The rose bed had already been tidied, trampled flowers removed, soil smoothed. Too smooth, Miss Marple thought. She knelt and examined the ground carefully. Near the fountain she noticed faint footprints, smaller than the Reverend's, deeper than a child's. Women's shoes. "He didn't come here alone," Miss Marple said softly. Graves looked unconvinced. "It was a public event." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but poisoning rarely is." That afternoon Miss Marple paid several quiet visits. She spoke to Mrs. Dalrymple again, this time about the parish accounts, to Mrs. Greenaway, who had last spoken with the Reverend, to Mr. Collins, the churchwarden, who admitted, reluctantly, that Reverend Hartley had recently been concerned about certain discrepancies. "He said he meant to look into things properly," Mr. Collins said, "after the summer fete." "And did that worry anyone?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Collins hesitated. Mrs. Dalrymple was defensive. As evening approached, Miss Marple returned home and sat by the window once more. A cup served separately, a tonic bottle emptied too soon. A man who intended to ask questions. Patterns were forming. The poison, she believed, had not been administered in haste. It had been prepared carefully, slipped into something familiar, something trusted. Tea, or perhaps something taken just before it. As the sun set over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple felt the quiet certainty settle in. Reverend Hartley had not died of weakness. He had been helped. Chapter 2. Call to Action. Do you suspect the poison was in the tea, or hidden in something the Reverend took regularly? Share your theory below. Chapter 3. The Tonic and the Thorns. Miss Marple had always found that when people spoke of habits, they often revealed more than they intended. Habits, after all, were repetitions, and repetition was the enemy of secrecy. The morning following Reverend Hartley's death was uncomfortably bright. Sunlight fell generously over St. Mary Mead, illuminating the parish garden as though nothing dreadful had occurred there at all. The roses were already being replaced. Fresh soil had been turned. Order, once disrupted, was being restored with remarkable speed. Miss Marple watched from a distance. "Too soon," she murmured. She had been invited to the vicarage that morning by Dr. Simmons, who appeared eager to reassure both himself and the village that nothing untoward had occurred. "I've gone over it again," he said, adjusting his spectacles as they sat in the study. "The heart can fail without warning. Stress, fatigue." "Yes," Miss Marple said kindly. "And tonics." Dr. Simmons paused. "I beg your pardon?" "The brown bottle," Miss Marple said, "on the side table." "Oh, that." He waved a hand. "Just a mild herbal mixture. I prescribed it months ago." "And recently?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Simmons frowned. "Recently? I suppose he did request a refill." "When?" Miss Marple asked. "Earlier this week," he said. "Why?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "No reason at all." Later that day, she paid a visit to Mrs. Dalrymple. The woman was seated at her kitchen table, surrounded by ledgers and papers, her expression taut. "I understand the Reverend was concerned about parish accounts," Miss Marple said casually. Mrs. Dalrymple stiffened. "He misunderstood." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," Mrs. Dalrymple replied sharply. "These things are complicated." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "especially when people begin asking questions." Mrs. Dalrymple pushed back her chair. "Are you accusing me of something?" "No," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I am observing." She glanced at the shelf behind Mrs. Dalrymple. There, among jars of preserves and tins of tea, stood several small bottles, some labeled, some not. One in particular caught her eye. A faint residue clung to its neck. "May I?" Miss Marple asked. Without waiting for permission, she lifted the bottle and sniffed lightly. Bitter. Very faint, but unmistakable. Mrs. Dalrymple's hand trembled. "That's nothing. Just a weed killer." "Of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "For the roses?" "Yes," Mrs. Dalrymple said too quickly. "They've been infested." Miss Marple nodded. Later, in the garden itself, Miss Marple examined the rose beds once more. She knelt, careful of her skirt, and brushed her fingers lightly against the thorns. "Curious," she said softly. Several rose bushes near the fountain appeared wilted, not dead, but weakened. The leaves were curled slightly, discolored at the edges. Poisoned. Not enough to kill them outright, just enough to demonstrate effect. Miss Marple straightened slowly. Poison, she reflected, was rarely tested on people first. That afternoon, Inspector Graves returned. Miss Marple walked with him along the garden path, pointing out the wilted plants. "You think this is connected?" he asked. "I think someone practiced," Miss Marple replied. Graves frowned. "Practiced for what?" "For dosage," Miss Marple said. "For timing." "For subtlety." They stopped near the tea table, now cleared away. "The Reverend trusted Mrs. Dalrymple," Miss Marple continued. "She prepared his tea, she managed parish funds, and she had access to substances strong enough to harm but not immediately kill." "Circumstantial," Graves said. "Entirely," Miss Marple agreed. "For now." That evening, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at Mrs. Bantry's. Conversation turned, inevitably, to Reverend Hartley. "He was worried," Mrs. Greenaway said, "about money." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "and about people who disliked questions." "Mrs. Dalrymple always ran things her own way," someone said. "She did," Miss Marple agreed, "and when habits are threatened, people sometimes reach for solutions." As she walked home later, Miss Marple passed the parish garden once more. The roses stood quietly in the dusk, thorns catching the fading light. The tonic bottle, the weed killer, the wilted roses. Each alone meant very little. Together, they suggested something far more deliberate. Reverend Hartley had been careful. He had trusted the familiar, and someone had used that trust against him. Miss Marple paused at the gate. The killer, she believed now, had not acted in panic. They had prepared. And preparation, Miss Marple knew, was always the most dangerous clue of all. Chapter 3. Call to Action. Do you think the poison was tested on the roses before being used on the Reverend? Or is that a clever misdirection? Share your theory below. Chapter 4. A kindness offered at the right moment. Miss Marple had often remarked, privately and only to herself, that kindness could be one of the most dangerous disguises of all. In St. Mary Mead, kindness was plentiful, freely offered, and rarely questioned. It arrived in casseroles left on doorsteps, in sympathetic nods during Sunday service, and in gentle hands pressing cups of tea into trembling fingers. After Reverend Hartley's death, kindness flowed more freely than ever. Miss Marple watched it carefully. The vicarage had become a place of quiet pilgrimage. Villagers came to offer condolences, to share memories, to reassure themselves that tragedy had not truly touched them. Each visit followed the same pattern: soft voices, polite restraint, and an almost eager willingness to accept simple explanations. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the window, observed every gesture. Mrs. Dalrymple was everywhere. She coordinated visits, arranged meals, answered questions, and gently redirected conversations when they strayed too close to uncomfortable territory. Her efficiency was admirable. Her timing, Miss Marple thought, was impeccable. "You must be exhausted," Miss Marple said gently one afternoon as Mrs. Dalrymple poured tea in the vicarage sitting room. "Oh, I don't mind," Mrs. Dalrymple replied briskly. "It helps to keep busy." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "it often does." She accepted the cup but did not drink. Instead, she watched as Mrs. Dalrymple offered refreshments to Mrs. Greenaway, who looked pale and shaken. "Have some tea," Mrs. Dalrymple urged. "You mustn't let this upset your nerves." Mrs. Greenaway hesitated. "I don't usually—" "It will do you good," Mrs. Dalrymple insisted gently. Miss Marple noticed the small pause before the cup was handed over. The slight adjustment of the saucer, the careful placement. That evening, Miss Marple spoke with Mr. Collins, the churchwarden, as they walked along the lane. "Reverend Hartley intended to review the parish accounts," Miss Marple said casually. "Yes," Mr. Collins admitted. "He'd mentioned irregularities." "And did Mrs. Dalrymple know this?" Miss Marple asked. "Oh, certainly," Mr. Collins replied. "She was quite offended by the suggestion." Offended, Miss Marple reflected, was a strong word. Later, she visited Dr. Simmons once more. "You prescribed the tonic," Miss Marple said, "but you didn't prepare it yourself." "No," Dr. Simmons admitted. "I gave the formula to Mrs. Dalrymple. She insisted on making it locally, said it was more economical." "And you trusted her?" Miss Marple asked. "She's been managing parish matters for years," he said. "There was no reason not to." Trust again. Miss Marple returned to the parish garden just before dusk. The wilted rose bushes stood out more clearly now. She knelt, examining the soil carefully. Near the base of one bush, she noticed a faint stain, barely visible, but darker than the surrounding earth. She touched it lightly with the tip of her glove and brought it close to her nose. Bitter. Not roses. Not soil. Poison. As she stood, she heard footsteps behind her. Mrs. Dalrymple stood a few paces away, her expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here alone," she said. "It's been upsetting for everyone." "Has it?" Miss Marple asked, mildly. Mrs. Dalrymple's lips tightened. "People need time to heal." "Some people," Miss Marple replied, "need time to hide." The words hung between them. Mrs. Dalrymple recovered quickly. "You're imagining things." "Possibly," Miss Marple said, "but imagination is often guided by habit." She gestured toward the roses. "You tend your garden carefully, don't you?" Mrs. Dalrymple stiffened. "Of course." "And you tend people the same way," Miss Marple continued gently, "offering what you believe they need when they are weakest." Mrs. Dalrymple said nothing. That night, Miss Marple lay awake, replaying the day's observations. The tonic, the tea, the roses, the insistence on kindness. Poison did not require violence. It required access, trust, and patience. And Mrs. Dalrymple had all three. Yet something troubled Miss Marple. Mrs. Dalrymple was efficient, but not careless. If she had intended to kill, would she really have left so many traces? Wilted roses, bitter residue, a tonic prepared too freely. Unless she believed herself protected by routine, by reputation, by the village's unquestioning acceptance of her role, or unless someone else had used her habits as cover. Miss Marple sat up in bed. Yes, that was it. Mrs. Dalrymple might be involved, but not necessarily alone. Someone else had benefited from Reverend Hartley's silence just as much, and someone else had known exactly how to hide behind her kindness. The garden, Miss Marple decided, had not yet revealed all its thorns. Call to action. Is Mrs. Dalrymple the true culprit, or is someone else using her kindness as the perfect disguise? Share your theory below. Chapter 5. The Man Who Knew Too Much. Miss Marple had always found that when suspicion settled too comfortably in one place, it was often because someone else was benefiting from the distraction. Mrs. Dalrymple's kindness, her tireless attention, her ready explanations had begun to draw the village's quiet unease toward her like moths to a lamp. It was understandable. She had access, opportunity, and a temperament well suited to control. Yet something about the situation remained unresolved in Miss Marple's mind. Mrs. Dalrymple was efficient, too efficient, perhaps, to be careless. That morning, Miss Marple requested a conversation with Mr. Collins, the churchwarden. She found him in the vestry, sorting hymn books with unnecessary vigor. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded. "Mr. Collins," Miss Marple said gently.
"You worked closely with Reverend Hartley."
"Yes," he replied, "for years." "And recently?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "Recently, there were disagreements." "About the accounts," Miss Marple prompted. Mr. Collins nodded. "He asked too many questions." "Questions that concerned you?" Miss Marple asked. "Questions that concerned everyone," he said defensively. "The parish runs on trust." "So does poison," Miss Marple thought, but did not say. Instead, she smiled politely. "Did Reverend Hartley confide in you?" Mr. Collins's jaw tightened. "He said if things didn't improve, he would involve the diocese." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And that would have caused difficulties?" "It would have caused disgrace," Mr. Collins said quietly. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Simmons outside the vicarage. He looked troubled.
"I've been thinking," he said, "about the tonic."
"Yes," Miss Marple replied. "It has been on my mind as well." "I never intended it to be prepared so freely," Dr. Simmons continued. "I gave the formula to Mrs. Dalrymple for convenience, but it could be altered." "Easily?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes," he admitted. "Dangerously so." "And who would know that?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Simmons frowned. "Anyone familiar with herbal mixtures, or someone who asked the right questions." Miss Marple thanked him and walked slowly toward the parish garden. There she found Mr. Collins standing near the rose beds, staring down at the soil. "Lovely flowers," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes," he replied. "Reverend Hartley was proud of them." "He spent a great deal of time here," Miss Marple observed, "thinking." Mr. Collins shifted his weight. He worried unnecessarily. "About money?" Miss Marple asked. "About exposure," Mr. Collins snapped, then stopped. Miss Marple turned to face him. "Exposure," she repeated gently. Mr. Collins looked away. "He misunderstood the accounts." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked. "Or did he understand them very well indeed?" The silence that followed was telling. That evening, Inspector Graves returned with new information. "The parish funds," he said quietly as they spoke in Miss Marple's sitting room, "they've been mismanaged, not stolen outright, but redirected, used to cover mistakes." "And Reverend Hartley discovered this?" Miss Marple said. "Yes," Graves replied, "and he planned to report it." "Which would have ruined someone," Miss Marple said softly. Graves nodded. "Mr. Collins most of all." As dusk fell, Miss Marple sat once more near the parish garden gate. She recalled a moment from the afternoon of the fete, one she had not considered important at the time. Mr. Collins had brought the Reverend his cup. Not Mrs. Dalrymple. He had done so casually, with a smile, remarking on the heat, urging him to drink. A small kindness, a well-timed one. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The poison did not need to be prepared at the table. It only needed to be added at the right moment. Mrs. Dalrymple's habits had provided cover. The tonic had provided plausibility. But the hand that delivered the cup, that belonged to Mr. Collins. Miss Marple rose slowly. She did not yet accuse, not yet, because motive alone was not enough. She needed confirmation, and confirmation she knew would come from pressure, the sort of pressure only truth could apply. Chapter 5. Call to Action. Has your suspicion shifted toward Mr. Collins, or do you still believe Mrs. Dalrymple is the true culprit? Share your theory below. Chapter 6. A Test of Habit. Miss Marple had learned, over many years, that the most reliable way to uncover guilt was not confrontation, but repetition. People returned to what they knew. They followed habits even when those habits placed them in danger, especially then. The morning after her realization about Mr. Collins, Miss Marple rose with a clear purpose. She did nothing unusual. That, she knew, was important. St. Mary Mead was already humming with its familiar rhythms. Doors opened, milk bottles clinked, voices carried along the lane. The parish garden, though still officially closed, was visible through the iron gate, roses steady once more, soil freshly turned, evidence smoothed away. Miss Marple walked directly to Mrs. Dalrymple's house. "I wondered if you might help me," she said pleasantly when the door opened. "I'm feeling rather faint. Too much excitement, I expect." Mrs. Dalrymple ushered her inside at once, all concern and efficiency. "Sit down," she said briskly. "I'll make you something." Miss Marple settled herself at the kitchen table, watching carefully as Mrs. Dalrymple moved about. The kettle was filled, the teapot warmed, a cup selected, one of the plainer ones, Miss Marple noted, not the floral set reserved for guests. Habits again. Mrs. Dalrymple reached for a small bottle near the window. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Oh, no tonic, thank you. Just tea." Mrs. Dalrymple paused, just for a fraction of a second. Then she replaced the bottle without comment. The tea was poured, milk added, no sugar. Miss Marple watched the cup closely as it was placed before her. There was no hesitation, no adjustment, no pause, no poison. Miss Marple smiled inwardly. Mrs. Dalrymple, she now knew, was not the one. After a polite conversation about parish matters and the weather, Miss Marple excused herself and walked slowly toward the church. There she found Mr. Collins arranging flowers near the altar. "Good morning," he said stiffly. "Good morning," Miss Marple replied. "I was hoping you might advise me." "Advise you?" he repeated. "Yes," she said, "about the parish garden. I hear it may reopen soon. I thought it might be nice to arrange a small gathering, nothing formal." Mr. Collins looked uneasy. "That seems premature." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked gently. "People do like routine restored." "Yes," he said slowly, "they do." "Would you mind," Miss Marple continued, "helping with refreshments? Mrs. Dalrymple has been so overworked." Mr. Collins hesitated. "I suppose I could." Miss Marple smiled. "How kind." That afternoon, Miss Marple arranged a modest tea in the vicarage sitting room. Only a few guests, Mrs. Greenaway, Dr. Simmons, and Mr. Collins himself. Mrs. Dalrymple was conspicuously absent. Miss Marple observed quietly as the tea was prepared. Mr. Collins handled the cups. He did so carefully, too carefully. He poured for everyone else first, then paused before Miss Marple's cup. "I'll bring yours," he said. Miss Marple watched him walk to the side table. She saw his hand slip briefly into his pocket. She saw the smallest movement of his fingers. Then he returned and placed the cup before her, smiling politely. "There you are," he said. Miss Marple thanked him and did not drink. Instead, she watched Dr. Simmons lift his cup. "Do be careful," Miss Marple said suddenly. "It's rather hot." Dr. Simmons paused, startled. Mr. Collins froze. Inspector Graves stepped forward from the doorway. "I think," he said quietly, "we should all put our cups down." The room fell silent. Graves crossed to the side table and examined the teapot.
then the milk jug, then Miss Marple's cup. He sniffed. Bitter. Mr. Collins's face drained of color. I only meant," he began. "You meant to repeat what had worked before," Miss Marple said gently, "because repetition is comforting." Mr. Collins sank into a chair. "I didn't want him dead," he said hoarsely. "I just needed him quiet, just long enough." "But poison does not bargain," Miss Marple said softly.
"It only waits." Inspector Graves placed a hand on Mr. Collins's shoulder. As officers escorted him away, Miss Marple felt no triumph, only certainty. The test had been simple. The habit had betrayed him. And the garden, once again, had revealed its secret. Chapter 6. Call to Action. Was Miss Marple right to test Mr. Collins, or did she risk too much by placing herself in danger? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 7. After the cup was set down. The room felt altered once Mr. Collins was led away. Not emptier, exactly, but rearranged, as though the air itself had shifted to accommodate the truth. Chairs stood where they had been moments before, cups rested quietly on saucers, and yet nothing belonged where it once had. Miss Marple sat very still. Dr. Simmons was the first to speak. "Good heavens," he said softly. "If you hadn't warned me—" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "If."
Inspector Graves nodded toward the untouched cups. "We'll have these tested immediately."
"Of course," Miss Marple said. "But you already know what you'll find."
Graves allowed himself a brief, grim smile. Enough to hold him. As the others dispersed, the vicarage seemed to exhale. Miss Marple remained behind, gazing at the table where the tea had been laid so carefully. It struck her, as it often did in such moments, how little drama was required to change a life irrevocably. A hand slipping into a pocket, a cup offered at precisely the right moment. Kindness, once again, used as a weapon. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked slowly toward the parish garden. The gate was still closed, but no longer locked. Someone had opened it, perhaps unintentionally.
She stepped inside, following the familiar gravel path toward the rose beds. The flowers were recovering. New blossoms had begun to open, pale and tentative. Mrs. Dalrymple stood near the fountain. She turned as Miss Marple approached, her expression weary rather than defensive. "So," Mrs. Dalrymple said quietly, "it was Mr. Collins?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I suspected," Mrs. Dalrymple said, "after the first shock passed." "And yet you said nothing," Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Dalrymple sighed. "Because I feared being suspected myself." "That fear," Miss Marple said gently, "made you complicit." Mrs. Dalrymple winced. "I know." They stood in silence for a moment. "He came to me weeks ago," Mrs. Dalrymple continued. "Asked questions about the tonic." "About how strong it could be made without being obvious." "And you answered?" Miss Marple asked. "I did," Mrs. Dalrymple admitted. "I told myself it was curiosity. I never imagined—" "No," Miss Marple said softly. "People rarely do." As they spoke, Mrs. Greenaway approached hesitantly. "I just wanted to say," she began, "how grateful we all are. To you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Gratitude is best directed toward caution in future." Mrs. Greenaway nodded, chastened. That evening, Inspector Graves visited Miss Marple once more.
"The lab confirmed it," he said. "The same compound in the tea, the tonic, and traces in the soil near the roses."
"Consistency," Miss Marple said. "A terrible thing for a criminal."
"He confessed," Graves added. "Said he thought no one would look too closely."
That the village preferred comfort to truth. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window. Villages often do. "And Mrs. Dalrymple?" Graves asked. "She will carry her own sentence," Miss Marple replied. "Guilt has a long memory." The sun dipped lower as Graves departed. Miss Marple prepared her evening tea carefully, measuring the leaves, timing the pour, performing each step with deliberate attention. She drank it slowly, thoughtfully. Later she wrote a brief letter. No accusations, no drama, just a quiet suggestion to the diocese regarding oversight and accountability. Small actions, she reflected, mattered most. As night settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked one last time past the parish garden. The roses stirred slightly in the breeze, thorns catching the moonlight. Poison had been introduced through familiarity, through trust, through the belief that no one would notice. But someone had noticed. And that, Miss Marple believed, was the real lesson. Not that evil existed, but that vigilance did, too. Chapter 7. Call to Action. Do you think Mrs. Dalrymple's silence makes her partly responsible? Or does guilt belong only to the one who poured the poison? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 8. What Poison Leaves Behind. Once the truth had been spoken aloud, St. Mary Mead did not collapse into outrage or grief. Instead, it adjusted itself with practiced efficiency, like a village straightening a crooked picture and insisting it had always hung that way. Miss Marple observed this with interest. The parish garden reopened within days. Fresh soil had been laid, damaged rose bushes replaced, and a small plaque erected near the fountain in Reverend Hartley's memory. It spoke of service, kindness, and dedication. It did not mention suspicion, fear, or the questions that had preceded his death. Perhaps, Miss Marple reflected, that was inevitable. She arrived early one morning before the villagers gathered and sat alone on a bench near the roses. The air was cool, scented faintly with earth and dew. The garden looked peaceful once more, but peace, she knew, was not the same as innocence. Mrs. Dalrymple joined her a short while later.
"I've resigned,"
she said quietly, without preamble. Miss Marple nodded. "That seems wise."
"I should have spoken sooner,"
Mrs. Dalrymple continued.
"I saw what he was becoming, what he was willing to do."
"Yes," Miss Marple said, "and you chose silence." Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes filled briefly, then cleared. "I thought silence would protect the parish."
"It rarely does," Miss Marple replied gently. "It only delays harm."
They sat together for a moment, listening to the birds. "What will happen to him?" Mrs. Dalrymple asked at last.
"The law will decide," Miss Marple said, "but the weight of knowledge will remain regardless."
Later that day, Miss Marple paid a final visit to the vicarage. The house felt empty now, not abandoned, but stripped of certainty. Books remained on the shelves, sermons half written on the desk, personal effects arranged neatly, as though Reverend Hartley might return at any moment. Miss Marple paused in the study. She examined the desk carefully and found, tucked beneath a stack of correspondence, a small notebook. Inside were notes, lists of questions, figures copied from accounts, names underlined once. She knew such resolutions faded easily with time. As evening approached, she returned home and packed her things. Mrs. Bantry visited briefly, bringing a small cake and an expression of earnest concern. "It's dreadful," she said. "To think it happened right under our noses." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That is usually how it happens." When Miss Marple left St. Mary Mead the following morning, the parish garden lay quiet in the early light. Dew clung to the petals. The roses looked almost innocent. Almost. Poison, Miss Marple reflected, did not always kill immediately. Sometimes it lingered, in memory, in guilt, in the way a community chose what to remember and what to forget. The Reverend's death had ended a life, but it had also exposed a habit, and habits, once revealed, could be changed, if people chose to see them.
Chapter 8. Call to Action.
Do you think the village truly learned from Reverend Hartley's death, or will comfort eventually erase the lesson? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 9. The Weight of Quiet Choices. Justice arrived in St. Mary Mead not with spectacle, but with paperwork. Miss Marple had long suspected it would be so. The formal proceedings against Mr. Collins began quietly, announced in the local paper with restrained phrasing. There were no crowds, no dramatic arrests. Only a steady procession of statements, examinations, and confirmations, each one stripping away the careful respectability that had once shielded him. Miss Marple read the notice over breakfast, folded the paper neatly, and placed it beside her untouched toast. In the village, reactions were muted. Some expressed disbelief, others disappointment. A few, more honest than most, admitted that they were not surprised at all. "It's always the ones who seem most dependable," Mrs. Bantry remarked during a visit that afternoon. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Dependability is often confused with harmlessness." As days passed, details emerged. Mr. Collins had not intended to kill Reverend Hartley, at least not initially. The poison he used was meant to weaken, to frighten, to delay inquiry. He had miscalculated the dosage, underestimated the Reverend's condition, and overestimated his own control. That, Miss Marple thought, was the heart of it. Control. Inspector Graves visited once more, bringing news. "He's admitted to everything," he said. "Said he panicked when Hartley spoke of involving the diocese." "And Mrs. Dalrymple?" Miss Marple asked.
She confirmed the conversations about the tonic, Graves replied, but insists she never believed he would act.
Miss Marple nodded. "Belief is a convenient shelter." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the parish garden. It was busier now. Children played near the fountain. Elderly villagers sat on benches, exchanging mild complaints. Life, resilient as ever, pressed forward. Miss Marple sat quietly, observing. Mrs. Greenaway approached hesitantly. "Do you think we should have noticed?" she asked. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Greenaway flushed. "We trusted him." "Trust," Miss Marple replied, "is not a substitute for attention." Nearby, Mrs. Dalrymple supervised the planting of new rose bushes, her movements slower, her expression subdued. She caught Miss Marple's eye and looked away.
The punishment she carried was not written in law.
That evening, Miss Marple visited the vicarage one last time. The study was being cleared, books boxed, papers sorted. The sense of interruption lingered. She paused at the desk and imagined Reverend Hartley seated there, pen in hand, weighing his next step. He had known the risks. He had chosen to act anyway. Courage, Miss Marple reflected, often frightened those who benefited from silence. As she left, the church bells rang softly. not for morning, but for the evening hour. Their sound drifted across the village, familiar and reassuring. Familiarity, she knew, could be dangerous. That night, Miss Marple wrote a short letter to her nephew Raymond, describing the case in careful terms. "People," she wrote, "often believe evil requires passion. In truth,
It more often requires only the permission of comfort."
She sealed the envelope and set it aside. The following morning, as she prepared to depart St. Mary Mead for a short visit elsewhere, Inspector Graves came to say goodbye. "You were right," he said, "about habits." "They rarely lie," Miss Marple replied. "And about silence?" "Yes," she said softly. "That too." The car waited at the end of the lane. Miss Marple took one last look at the parish garden, at the roses newly planted, their thorns still sharp. The poison had been removed, but the lesson remained. And whether the village would remember it was, as always, a matter of choice. Chapter 9. Call to Action. Do you think Mr. Collins's intentions matter, or is the outcome all that counts? Share your thoughts below.
Chapter 10. When the Garden Falls Silent.
Miss Marple had always believed that endings should be allowed to arrive gently. Anything louder, she felt, suggested unfinished thinking. The final week of summer settled over St. Mary Mead with deceptive calm. Mr. Collins's case moved steadily through the courts, its details reported with careful restraint. The language of the law softened what had happened, phrases like unlawful administration and reckless endangerment replacing the blunt reality of a life ended. Sentence would come in time. Consequences always did. Miss Marple read the notices once and did not return to them. Instead, she walked. The parish garden was open again, its paths freshly swept, benches repaired, roses newly planted where others had failed. The plaque near the fountain had been polished.
Villagers paused before it occasionally, heads bowed, expressions suitably solemn. Miss Marple sat nearby, knitting in her lap. A young mother guided her child past the rose beds, warning gently about the thorns. The child listened, wide-eyed, careful where she placed her hands. That, Miss Marple thought, is how lessons should be learned. Mrs. Bantry joined her a little later. "I heard they've settled the accounts," she said. "Everything's been reviewed. Committees formed?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Committees are very comforting." "But necessary," Mrs. Bantry insisted. "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed, "when people remember why they were needed." They watched the fountain ripple softly. "I keep thinking about Reverend Hartley," Mrs. Bantry said. "He trusted the wrong people." "He trusted the familiar," Miss Marple corrected. As most of us do.
That afternoon, Miss Marple paid her final visit to the vicarage. The rooms echoed faintly now. Furniture had been rearranged, the study partially cleared. The sense of interruption remained, but it had softened, becoming something closer to memory than loss. Miss Marple stood before the desk one last time. Reverend Hartley's notebook had been catalogued as evidence, but one phrase lingered in her mind. Trust must be earned again. He had understood, too late, that tradition alone was not protection, that decency required vigilance, that kindness, when unquestioned, could be misused. Outside, church bells rang, not mournful this time, but steady and ordinary. Miss Marple walked back toward her cottage, suitcase waiting by the door. Inspector Graves arrived just before her departure. "They've sentenced him," he said.
Not as harshly as some might like.
"No," Miss Marple replied, "but enough." He admitted he thought the village would prefer the simpler explanation,
Graves added. Natural causes? A tragic accident? Yes, Miss Marple said softly. People often do. They stood together for a moment. You could have been wrong, Graves said. You took risks. I took observations, Miss Marple replied. The risks were already there. When the car finally carried her away, Miss Marple looked back toward the parish garden. The roses stirred in the late afternoon breeze. Their petals caught the light. Their thorns remained sharp. A garden, she reflected, required more than care. It required attention. Neglect invited weeds. Blind trust invited poison. St. Mary Mead would endure. It always did. But whether it would remember, that remained uncertain.
Miss Marple turned her gaze forward. Somewhere else, another place that looked perfectly ordinary was waiting. And somewhere within it, another quiet danger had already begun to grow.
Chapter 10. Call to Action. Which moment in the story do you think truly sealed the culprit's fate? The tea, the tonic, or the silence of others? Share your final thoughts below. When the roses bloom again, and so, dear listener, the parish garden of St. Mary Mead returns to its quiet routines. The roses bloom once more, their colors carefully tended, their thorns discreetly ignored. Benches are repainted, gravel paths swept smooth, and conversations resume as though nothing terrible had ever taken place among the flower beds. Yet something has changed. A life was lost, not in anger or chaos, but through patience, planning,
and the dangerous comfort of familiarity. Reverend Hartley trusted the structures meant to protect him, and those very structures were turned against him. Miss Marple leaves the village as she always does, without ceremony, without expectation of thanks. She carries no triumph, only the understanding that vigilance, not suspicion, is the true guardian of decency. Perhaps that is the quiet warning she leaves behind, that kindness should never excuse blindness, that tradition must be examined, not assumed, and that evil rarely announces itself. It blends in, waits, and relies on our reluctance to look too closely. Thank you for listening, for walking through this mystery one careful step at a time, and for paying attention to the smallest details, because, as Miss Marple knows, those details matter most of all. If this story held your attention, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Which moment unsettled you the most? Which clue lingered after the truth was revealed? And if you would like to return to St. Mary Mead, or explore another mystery entirely, stay close, because somewhere, in a place that seems perfectly safe, another secret is already taking root. Until next time, take care and look carefully.